Welcome to this segment of the Family Business Education Initiative, brought to you by the Small Business Administration and Mississippi State University's College of Business. Joining us for this segment on responding to COVID-19 is one of the Family Business Education Initiative co-founders. That's a big title. Dr. James Vardaman, good to have you here.
Great to be here.
So we've been living with COVID now for about a year, and it has had an impact all across the board, every facet of business. But one has had to do with employees and employee relationships and retaining employees. What are you seeing out there?
Well, I think especially now, this is going to start to become an issue. You know, I mean, unemployment's been up, but it's sort of been, I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's been clustered in industries, and it's not a good time to be looking for a job for sure. But as we're coming out of it, I think that we're in a pretty unique situation where turnover retention is going to be an issue. And I think that it's something that business owners and managers need to be thinking about as we sort of come out, as the vaccines continue to come on board. We're doing a good job of getting further, up the ladder on that. And as things get back to normal, I think retention and turnover is going to be a real thing that is going to be of high concern
tell us all the things you're going to touch on today.
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually going to talk about why retention and turnover matters right now. Again, some people watching this might think, why are we talking about turnover? This would be a really bad time for anyone to be looking for a job. But as we come out of this, it's going to be a real problem, I think, and I'll talk about why. Well, for people who don't know a lot about turnover, I'm going to talk about turnover, sort of the facts behind it, sort of the research behind it. Turnover is usually a process. It's not usually despite what we see in movies or whatever, people just say, "The heck with it, I quit, I'm out of here."
And everybody thinks it's always about money, but that's not the case.
Yeah, that's not true. That's the thing I'm going to get to next is pay can matter. It does not matter nearly as much as most people think. There's a lot of myths surrounding turnover, but there are some issues with pay that you should think about, but they're not the ones you probably have in your mind, at the outset. From there, I'm going to talk about sort of how to keep your keepers, and the biggest thing involves relationships. Those matter. As I say on the slide, there a lot. And then I'm going to offer some recommendations around these 5 things for how you can keep your keepers.
Well, let's jump right in and ask. I guess the big question is, why is retention even important? And there's some obvious answers there, but when you talk about what you invest to develop a good employee, but you tell us why retention is important during COVID.
Yeah. So first, I'll talk about why it matters in case people are wondering. I mean, it's very expensive to recruit, go through selection, give them the test that you give them to do it. You lose productivity by having people missing. You lose memory in your organization, people who know how to do things. You lose mentors. And so obviously, in general, retention is an important thing. I mean, a little turnover is fine because you want to get your low performers out at times, and you want to get some new blood in, but you don't want it to be too high because of all those things I just mentioned. There's a lot of costs associated with it.
All right, so we know that unemployment is up, but what does that mean, if I can ask that question? I mean, it's up. So what? If you're hiring, does that mean there's more people out there? Are there fewer jobs? Are people disgruntled and leaving the workforce? They don't like working at home? I mean, what does it mean unemployment is up?
Yeah, so unemployment's up right now, obviously. If you look at the statistics, unemployment's up, but it's not up like it was a year ago. You haven't had those mass layoffs. In fact, the unemployment rate is coming down pretty rapidly, and it's actually historically at a pretty okay number at this moment. Even during the pandemic, though, unemployment's kind of clustered in more heavily in certain industries, and especially in like knowledge work and things like that. Unemployment's really not that big of an issue right now, and so you have the labor market's a little loose right now, but it's not as loose as you would think during a big recession. Certainly not as loose as it was at the end of the 08 recession, 09, time period.
Are you seeing companies taking this downtime and perhaps reevaluating who they are, where they are, what their mission is, what their culture is?
Yeah, I mean, people don't like this word. There is sort of a reset going on, I think. I think not just on the employer end, but also on the employee end. And so that's, I think, one of the big dangers for businesses right now is, even though it's still not a great time to be looking for a job, but employees right now have been at home a lot. They've had a lot of time to think, and that idle time has provided an opportunity for people to sort of go into some introspection and think, is this really what I want to be doing? Do I feel comfortable here? Do I feel secure in my employment situation. And so that's one thing that I wanted to point out today is coming out of this thing, and we're coming out of this thing pretty soon, I think. Once things get back more to normal, people are going to, when those opportunities are out there, people are going to have had a lot of time to think and are going to be thinking, is this really what I want to be doing? Do I want to be doing it somewhere else? So there's been a lot of time for introspection among the workforce. So you might see a lot of people interested in more mobility, right? Coming out of this thing. And that's sort of the big danger. That's why I think this session we're doing here is really timely, because coming out of this thing, retention could be a real issue for businesses.
All right, and so relationships are going to be a big weighted factor in what the employee decides to do, right? Because if times are tough, that's one thing, but if you feel you've got some support or feel you belong and are worthwhile in an organization.
Yeah, so my research particularly, and you and I have spoken about this before, really shows that relationships are an embedding factor. Relationships, among workers really keep people in the fold. It creates this bond. And what have we been doing for the last year? We haven't been having lunch together. We haven't been interacting in person. We have been doing Zooms and WebExes and whatever, but as you know, they're not the same. I mean, to me, they're not the same for sure. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm worried about coming out of this thing, and what I think businesses should be worried about, is that some of those relationships, I wouldn't say they're fractured, but they're not as strong as they might have been. And so the lure of going elsewhere, or the thoughts of going elsewhere, may be more prevalent coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, and you alluded to it earlier when you said that we have this maybe Hollywood visualization of what turnover means, and I'm not going to take it anymore. Yeah. I quit, and you're out the door. But you say it's really more complicated. That's a process.
Yeah. So, but we call those impulsive quits. Those are incredibly rare, for obvious reasons. I mean, leaving a job is a really serious life decision. Most people, unless they're very, very impulsive, don't just say to heck with it, I'm out of here. Especially if it's a career job. So turnover is actually usually a process. The research shows, thousands of studies, turnover is a process. People experience some form of job dissatisfaction. Something happens. It could be just the relationship with a supervisor starts going downhill. Something happens. They don't get a bonus they expected. They don't get a pay raise they expected, something like that. And so they experience some form of job dissatisfaction that happens, and that sort of leads them down this road. But it's not an automatic, I experience dissatisfaction, I'm out of here. It leads them down a road to, they start looking, they start reaching out to their people they know at other companies, they start sort of checking out what's going on, and that's sort of the starting point.
So it would seem logical that an effective manager would recognize these and be working on creating an environment where the employee feels valued, however that's defined, pay or whatever, responsibility, and chooses to stay. But you can't make everybody happy in an organization.
Yeah, you work anywhere long enough, you're going to experience some form of dissatisfaction. That's, and I'll talk about this more later, but that's why the relationships are so important. Because you work anywhere long enough, I'm sure you've at some point, I know you love working here, but at some point you've probably experienced some dissatisfaction yourself, and I know, same for me. So you can't prevent all of it. You should take every opportunity you can to try to sort of insulate people or reduce that dissatisfaction, reduce the factors that might lead to dissatisfaction. But people are going to get into arguments. People are going to, let each other down from time to time if you work together long enough. And so you can't prevent all of that, but you should do as much as you can.
So people are going to be people. I mean,
Yes.
it's at work, in our relationships, we're just going to be people, not always get along. So you got to navigate that. But most folks seem to think at the end of the day it comes down to pay. But it might, but that's not always the case, right?
Yeah. So this is one of the big myths about turnover, is that it's usually about pay, and it's usually not actually. Pay does matter. The biggest hurdle you've got to get over is you've got to pay adequately. You've got to pay fair. Once you get into that fair pay range, once people perceive that their pay is fair, it's usually not a big problem unless people start making negative comparisons, and those are really damaging. So when I say negative comparisons, I mean someone doing the same job in the same company compares unfavorably with someone else doing the same job in the same company. So, we do the same job, you make more than me. That is a really negative factor. Or especially if I feel like I'm doing a better job than you. for example. And that's why sometimes, the idea of cronyism or nepotism in businesses is so damaging, is because people perceive that it's unfair. Another one is if I'm working at a company doing a job and somebody else at another company that I know is doing the same job and they're making more, that can be a real problem. So the negative comparisons are really the problem, as long as you're at an adequate level. As long as people feel like I make an appropriate amount of money to be a professor at this type of university,
right,
then that's fine, unless I make a negative comparison, across the industry or within my firm.
Well, and there's also a risk for the company, though. If you are chasing dollars all the time, it never ends. So you have a responsibility to the bottom line of the business as well, and there's no magic formula. You have to just work through all that.
Well, yeah, and it's most companies, if they see on someone's resume that they're hopping around like that, they don't, because no one wants that. No one wants a job hopper. And so really, though, most of the research shows that there's not a ton of job hopping. It's more prevalent among the younger set, but it's really not just a simple pay increase is usually not the reason that people will leave a job, unless it's if it's a hugely substantial one, they might, but just for an ordinary pay increase, people are not leaving. It's usually something else.
All right, so bottom line, why are folks leaving?
Well, as we see here, it's usually due to dissatisfaction with their boss or some other aspect of the job. I mean, a lot of the research shows that it's usually some sort of issue with the boss, not always, but some psychological contract violation. They didn't give me what I thought they would give me, or I'm not getting what I think I deserve, or something like that. Other things can play a role. Those negative pay comparisons that we talked about. An unsolicited job offer can come along every now and then. If it's a quantum leap in salary, that will pull someone away. And there's other factors out of the employee's control. A spouse wants you to move. Issue with the family, something like that. So that can also play a role. So I don't want to discount all those things, but really, it's usually some form of dissatisfaction. And that's broadly defined, but is almost always some form of dissatisfaction with some aspect of the job, usually interaction with the supervisor.
All right, so the last point on there sort of is the conundrum, though. So
sure.
Say you and I work in the same place with the exact same job title or pay grade or whatever, but you bring some intangibles to the table, right? You're the rallying guy. I'm the complainer. Our output is technically the same, but your influence on other employees and on the company has value that's perhaps not tangible, perhaps is tangible. So you're making more money than me, but I see on the org chart we're the exact same level. So how do you wrestle with that?
That's a tough one. I mean,
how do you keep the keepers, I think is how you put it.
I'm going to talk about how to keep the keepers in a minute, but that situation you've laid out is a tough one. I think communication is a big key. I mean, a lot of times managers just forget about the communication aspect. And so I don't want to come off as some touchy-feely person in my prescriptions here for what people should do, but communication and relationships really matter. And if you can communicate to the people, hey, we really value this sort of, this glue situation. We got a glue guy here, and that maybe it can get through to them and sort of talk them down off that ledge if they're upset about a negative pay comparison.
So you mentioned in an upcoming slide that people don't leave the job necessarily, but they leave the boss.
That's an old adage, yes.
Okay. Well, so how so? Just the old school? I'm thinking of the old school Lou Grant kind of hey, out there barking all the time, right?
Yeah, it's not just that. It can be a lot of things. I mean, like we said, relationships can deteriorate over time. I think a lot of times when people point to a deteriorated relationship with a supervisor, it's hard to point to one episode. I mean, there are abusive episodes that can, of course, be a big problem, but sometimes it's just things just kind of fall apart over time. And so the adage you see there, people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. That's an old adage, and the research kind of bears that out. I mean, a big source of job dissatisfaction is the relationship with the boss. And people will experience things that push them down that turnover path. Sometimes they're just unavoidable. I'm not putting this all on the supervisor. I mean, workers, your attitude gets stale in one place at times, and sometimes that kind of thing can be unavoidable. But the way that you can sort of help both insulate people from developing that desire to go and sort of reel them back in is by fostering quality relationships, both with the supervisor, and an important one is also among other workers. Because think about what happens. Relationships fall, you're my supervisor. Our relationships kind of gotten a little hinky.
I need you to stay late tonight, James.
Yeah,
Sorry about that.
Yeah, exactly. I want you to do something that you don't really feel like doing, and you've been doing that to me a lot. Well, if I've got a big group of people who I consider close relationships, I can confide in, I can talk to, bouncing that sort of those feelings off of those people can help talk somebody off the ledge and not make it to a point where I say, hey, I want to get out of here. I don't want to work here anymore. It can sort of talk you off that ledge, so to speak.
All right, so how does that dynamic change with COVID?
Well, I mean, as we talked about, it's a lot harder to have those relationships when you can't walk to the cubicle next door or walk to the office down the hall, and you got to get on a Zoom call or a WebEx. People are at home with their families. Also, what constitutes sort of what I'd say is like a bad episode might be a lot lower. I'm at home with my kid. My kids are screaming. I'm trying to get my job done. Mm-hmm. Everybody's unhappy. We've been at home. We can't go do the things we've been doing. So people might be a little more on edge, which means the day you tell me that I've got to do more work than I was expecting makes me a little more angry, pushes me down that road. And it's also difficult to have people to bounce things off of. We can't go have a drink at 5 o'clock, every Wednesday like we were as a work unit, things like that. So relationships, I have strained on the slide there. It could be strained, or it could just be less strong. I think that's a big one too. It's less strong, and that's important because, as I was saying, it can insulate people from having those relationships. Can insulate people from even thinking about quitting. We have a bad interaction, I can bounce that off people. But it also, even if I develop that desire to go, having those friends, they can also reel you back in after you've already started to go down that road. And so the relationships are really, really, really important. And that's why, as I said at the beginning of our talk here, this could be a dangerous time coming out of this thing because the relationships aren't as strong. People have had a lot of time to be introspective. Companies are kind of resetting. This could be an interesting time for retention. And so I think that, business owners, managers should think about that a little more strongly as we come out of the pandemic. And
it'll probably be some time, I guess, till you can really get some good research and draw some conclusions about what all's transpiring. But anecdotally, a lot of us worked at home and we thought that was just great for a while. And then when you add the kids on top of that, and then you miss the socialization of the workforce and all that goes along with it, the dynamics, right? And just you miss that. And so it went from, this is great, I'm in my pajamas and I'm on a call, and this is, to, boy, man, I just miss my peeps. I want to get back out there.
Yeah, and I think the perception of this is great, even for a little while, was a lot different for people with young children versus older children, especially mothers. And I think that it was great maybe for a very short time for a lot of those people, because it's I can attest from experience, it's very difficult to work when you have young kids at home.
Yeah, well, and my wife and I were both working from home, and just staying out of each other's way became a, where are you setting up shop? Okay, where are you setting? You just barged in while I'm I mean, you got to manage all that.
Yeah, that's the point I was trying to make too. It's just people are probably more edgy. They don't have those work relationships to help reel them back in. I mean, this is going to be an interesting time coming out of this thing.
All right, well, you're the expert, so give us some recommendations moving forward.
Sure. And it's all rooted in what we've talked about, so far. I mean, I think this is pretty clear from our conversation we've had here, but don't assume turnover is not going to be a problem coming out of the pandemic. I mean, the labor markets have been a little loose, but the economy's getting better. It's going to tighten up, and you're going to have a lot of people who've been introspective and had an opportunity to think about what they want to do. And they've been pretty edgy. They may have some grudges or dissatisfaction sort of pent up that they're ready to look as soon as opportunities become available. So, managers and business owners should be thoughtful about upping their retention efforts as we come out of this. As far as pay and benefits go, the thing to know is just pay and benefits need to be in line with the market. You need to have a fair pay level. Again, pay is not the biggest factor. But if you're unfair, if you're below the market, people are going to make those negative comparisons within the industry, and they're going to they're going to look. They're going to have negative thoughts about that, and they're going to look. So make apples to apples comparisons. Make sure you're comparing to the right reference point with your salaries, so that things are fair for your employees, so that you can avoid those injustices in pay comparisons.
Yeah, and you'll never solve that completely because it's so subjective. It is,
and there's actually a lot of research on people's reference points, and so an interesting one is the way people sort of assess their own success is they compare themselves to people they went to high school with, which is an odd comparison. But if you really think about it, it's because the people you went to high school with sort of generally probably share your socioeconomic status. They're from the same town.
Right.
It's sort of a sort of rule of thumb for how to compare yourself. So you need to think about what your people are using in their industry to make comparisons. And again, you're never going to be perfect, but just try to avoid unfairness. You don't have to be at the top of the market, but avoid unfairness.
Well, and again, I guess that relationship always comes back. That word always comes back, and that can go a long way. If perhaps you don't feel you're compensated exactly as you want to be, but it's close, but you feel valued by the relationship and the reinforcement of, James, we are so glad you're part of this team.
Exactly.
That's important.
And I think about it, I'd have to give up my relationship with Jeffrey to leave here. I'd have to give up my relationship with Bob or John to leave here. I wouldn't get to see those guys every day. And so that's an embedding factor.
Well, and you're going to have the dynamics of what the workplace looks like, feels like is going to change. So you're going to have to not be afraid to get creative, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are still not back in their offices even now. And so it's really tough for employers to, foster those relationships. Back before this happened, I used to advise companies, do things to get your people together so they can see each other. Have things where people can actually forge stronger relationships, where it's not all about work, so that you can get sort of more intimate relationship between people, because that's going to help make them feel embedded, make them feel part of the unit. Here, you're going to have to use virtual approaches, because you have physical distancing. My advice would be as soon as we get to herd immunity and we get some safety, if I were an employer, I would be trying to create events like that where people can get together, even if they got to be masked still, get them together so they can see each other and get more intimate relations, and have a situation where there's that cohesion and tightness to keep people in the fold.
Yeah, so don't give up, even if things are a little testy and a little different. You've got to keep trying, and that relationship piece again comes back, that's important.
Yeah, so I've got some research where we showed that people who actually had stated, I want to leave here, if they had large numbers of friends, they wind up staying. The people who left were ones who kind of were on the fringes, weren't that embedded, didn't have that many friendships, didn't have that many advice relationships, good relationships with superiors, mentors, things like that. Those relationships are really good at both keeping people from going down the road and even reeling them back in once they've gone down the road a little bit, once they've looked for a job or something like that.
All right, so this has been trying for everyone, employers, employees alike. Now, as a researcher, what opportunities does this present? I mean, it seems to me you've got years and years of exciting, I guess, research ahead on what happened, what were some unexpected results. How do you plan to go about researching all of this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think that we're going to find out a lot. And again, we haven't been able to do a lot of research because it's kind of hard to, you can't go into a company right now, unless you're talking to people on Zoom. And I think people haven't fully made sense of it. I think it's going to be a couple of years down the road where we're going to figure out. We're going to learn a lot about sort of how employees are reacting to a crisis. And I think that's going to be really interesting to figure out, what that's doing to people. And also from a retention of employees standpoint, we're going to find out a lot about, is a crisis sort of a shock into itself? I mean, despite the fact that, there's not like a supervisor you can point it to, is the crisis itself sort of creating this thing where people say, I want to do something different. I want to go somewhere else. I want to do something else. And I think that's something we're going to find out in the coming years that'll be really interesting. By the way, I'm not sure that my research would be called exciting by many people, so thank you.
Well, to me it is fascinating, because even watching how students and professors respond to teaching online and to getting and receiving information, some folks thrive in that and some don't, and I know it's the same with employees. So in some cases, this work from home might be a good model and save resources for a company, but in other instances, depending on the company and the employee, we might have just found that the experiment doesn't work in that particular instance, and for X, Y, Z reason.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's been really interesting to look at how sort of the reactions people have had to this all online situation. I think at the beginning, a lot of people were like, hey, this is great. I'm not having to go to these meetings, and I can do this from home. But I think as more data, especially like from school kids, I don't know if you've seen some of the data from the kids who are doing, the K through 12 kids doing online learning, that the number of Fs are off the charts up across the country. And we're learning that younger kids especially are not responding to this as well as we would have liked. I think that's why some people have been pushing for more in-person instruction.
Well, and the whole socialization piece, and that's an important part of education for.
Yeah, that's a big reason why people go to school. And so yeah, I think it's going to be interesting as we study that going forward to see how sort of the difference in this virtual versus in-person meeting, learning, et cetera, especially over long periods of time, which is I think going to be an outcome of this.
Well, thanks for sharing your insights and expertise. We want to put up your contact information for folks to they can reach out to you with any questions. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I have been surprised at just some anecdotal observations of what I see out there. So I'm curious to see what the research shows down the road.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
We hope you found this session helpful as well, and we appreciate you watching.